Welcome to the story reading. God sees the truth, but waits. Part 1. In the town of Vladimir in Russia, there lived a wealthy young merchant named Ivan Aksanov. He owned 2 shops and a large house. Aksanov was a handsome, blonde, curly-haired fellow who loved to have fun and was very fond of singing. Years ago, when he was much younger, he sometimes drank too much and got into trouble. But after he got married, he gave up drinking. One summer afternoon, Aksanov was preparing to go to the fair at Nizhny where he hoped to sell his merchandise. As he was saying goodbye to his family, his wife said to him, "Ivan, please do not go to the fair today. I dreamed that something bad happened to you there. For my sake, please stay at home." Aksanov laughed and said, "You know that I have got to go to the fair. What are you afraid of?" His wife replied, "I do not know what I am afraid of. All I know is that I had a bad dream. I dreamed that you were coming home from the fair, and when you took off your cap, I saw that your hair had turned gray." Aksanov laughed and said, "That means good luck. You'll see. I'll sell everything I bring to the fair, and I'll come home with some wonderful presents for you all." Then Ivan kissed his wife and children, said goodbye, and departed. When he had traveled halfway to Nizhny, he met a merchant he knew, and they stopped at an inn superscript 2 for the night. They discussed business for a while. Then they had some tea together, and each man went to bed in separate rooms. Aksanov woke up before dawn. Knowing that it would be pleasant to travel while it was still cool, he went to the office and paid his bill. Then he got his horses and continued on his journey. When he had gone about 25 miles, he stopped at another inn and asked to have his horses fed. Aksanov went out onto the porch, ordered some tea, and took out his guitar and began to play. Suddenly, a carriage with 3 horses came dashing up to the inn. A police officer and 2 soldiers rushed out of the carriage. The officer walked straight up to Aksanov and began to question him. The officer asked him who he was and where he had come from. Aksanov answered the officer's questions fully. Then Aksanov said, "Would you like to have some tea with me?" But the officer ignored this and began to ask him more questions. He asked, "Where did you spend last night? Did you speak to another merchant? Did you see the other merchant this morning? Why did you leave the inn before dawn?" Aksanov wondered why the officer was asking him all these questions, but he described in detail everything that had happened. Then he asked, "Why are you cross-examining me as if I were a thief? I am a merchant traveling on business. There is no reason for you to question me." Then the officer said, "I am the chief of police in this district, and I am questioning you because the merchant with whom you had tea last night has been murdered. We must search your things." The soldiers and the chief unstrapped Aksanov's luggage and began searching through his belongings. Suddenly, the chief pulled a knife out of Aksanov's things. "Whose knife is this?" the chief demanded. Aksanov stared, shocked and amazed, at the blood-stained knife that had been taken out of his bag. "And whose blood is on the knife?" the chief of police asked sharply. Aksanov tried to answer, but he was so frightened he could hardly utter a word. He began to stammer, 1-1, "Do not know. That knife does not belong to me." The chief continued, "The merchant was found dead this morning. He had been stabbed to death in his bed. Now we find this bloodstained knife among your possessions. You are nervous and have a guilty look on your face. Tell me at once how you murdered the merchant and how much money you stole from him." Aksionov swore that he had not committed the murder and that the knife was not his. He swore that he had not seen the merchant after they drank tea together, and that the only money he had lost 8,000 rubles of his own. But Aksionov's voice kept breaking, his face was very pale, and he shook with fear as though he were guilty. The chief ordered the soldiers to tie up Aksionov and to put him in the carriage. All of his money and his goods were taken away from him, and he was sent to a nearby town and was thrown into jail. A trial was held, and he was convicted of murdering the merchant and stealing his money. At the end, Part 1. Aksionov is convicted of killing a merchant and is thrown into jail. Do you think that Aksionov or his wife will be able to prove that he is innocent? Or do you think he will spend many years in prison? See if you're right. Part 2. When Aksionov's wife heard that her husband was in jail, she did not know what to believe. Her children were all very young, one was still a baby. She took them all with her and went to the town where her husband was in prison. At first she was not allowed to see Aksionov, but finally she was given permission to see him. When she saw him in prison clothes with chains on his feet, she fainted and fell to the floor. After she got up, she gathered her children to her and sat down with them by her husband's side. She told him how things were back home and asked him what had happened. He told her everything that had taken place. Then she asked, "What can we do now?" "We must send a letter to the king," he said. "We must ask him to set me free. Surely they will not let an innocent man be punished." His wife said that she had already sent a petition to the king, and that the king refused to consider his case. Aksionov did not reply and stared sadly at the floor. Then his wife said, "You remember one dream that your hair had turned gray. You remember my dream? Oh, if only you had stayed home that day." Then she said softly, "Ivan, my dear husband, tell me the truth. Did you murder the merchant?" "So you do not believe me either," cried Aksionov, and covering his face with his hands, he burst into tears. Then a guard came to the cell and said that it was time for his wife and children to leave. So, for the last time, Aksionov said goodbye to his family. When they were gone, Aksionov thought about his wife's visit. He remembered that even she suspected him of killing the merchant. Then he said to himself, "It appears that only God knows the truth. God is the one to ask for mercy and the only one who can give it." Aksionov was sent to a prison camp in Siberia. For 26 years, 30 he lived there as a convict. The hair on his head turned as white as snow, and his beard grew very long. He walked slowly, seldom spoke, never laughed, and prayed often. Over the years, no news reached Aksionov from his home. He did not even know if his wife and children were still alive. Then one day a group of new convicts was brought into the prison. In the evening, the old prisoners gathered around the new ones and asked them where they came from and why they had been sent to the prison camp. Aksionov sat down near the newcomers and, with his eyes staring at the floor, listened to what they said. One of the new convicts was a tall, strong, and vigorous man who was about 60 years old. Well, friends, he was saying, the truth is I was sent here for nothing. I borrowed a horse that belonged to a friend, but I was arrested and was accused of stealing it. I explained that I took it because I was in a hurry to get home and that I was going to return it later. I kept telling them that the horse belonged to a friend of mine, but they insisted I had stolen it. The man shook his head and smiled. It's funny, he said, because once I really did do something that was wrong, but that time they didn't catch me. And now I have been sent here for doing nothing at all. Ah, well, life is hard to explain. Where are you from? Someone asked. I come from Vladimir. My name is Makar Simovich. When he heard that, Aksanov raised his head and said, Tell me, Simovich, do you know anything about a family named Aksanov? Have you heard of them? They were merchants in Vladimir. Are they still alive? Have I heard of them? Of course I have. The old woman is dead, but the children have worked hard and are rich, though their father is in Siberia. He is a convict like us, it seems. But for what crime did they send you here? Aksanov did not say anything for a long time. He did not like to speak about his misfortune. He only sighed and said, I have been in prison for 26 years. But what did you do? What was your crime? Makar Simovich asked. Aksanov was silent and would say no more. But the other convicts told Simovich why Aksanov was sent to Siberia, because someone had killed a merchant and had put the knife among Aksanov's things. When Simovich heard this, he looked closely at Aksanov, slapped himself on his knee, and exclaimed, Well, this is amazing. Really remarkable. Then he said softly to himself, But how old you've become? The other prisoners asked Simovich why he seemed so surprised, but Simovich did not answer. Aksanov wondered whether this man knew who had killed the merchant, so he said, Simovich, perhaps you have heard of that crime. Heard of it? Of course I have heard of it. It was on everyone's lips at the time. But that was long ago, and I don't remember much about it now. Perhaps you know who really killed the merchant, Aksanov said slowly. Simovich laughed and said, Well, it is obvious that the man who killed him was the man who was found with the bloody knife. Look, how could anyone put a knife into your bag while you were asleep? That would surely have woken you up. When Aksanov heard these words, he felt certain that this was the man who had killed the merchant. He got up and walked slowly away. And all that night Aksanov could not sleep. Before you read part 3, Aksanov was certain that Simovich killed the merchant. Do you think that Aksanov will prove that Simovich was guilty of the crime? Do you think that Aksanov will eventually be set free? See if you're right. Part 3. Aksanov could not sleep that night. He was extremely unhappy, and he thought about many things. He saw the image of his wife as she was when he left her to go to the fair at Nizhny. He remembered her face and her eyes and her voice. Then he remembered his children, who were very small at that time. And then he remembered himself as he used to be young and happy. He remembered how he had sat on the porch of the inn where they had arrested him, how he had played his guitar, and how cheerful he had been. Then he thought about the trial and about the terrible crime they said he had committed. He remembered the people staring at him and the chains he had worn. He thought about the 26 years he had been in prison and about how old he had become. The thought of it filled him with grief. And it's all his fault, thought Aksanov. And he was furious at Makar Semovich and wanted revenge. He could not go near the man. He could not even look at him. One evening, as Aksanov was wandering sadly around the prison, he noticed some earth on the floor near one of the bunks. As he was staring at it, Makar Semovich suddenly crawled out from under the bunk and glared up at Aksanov with a startled look on his face. Before Aksanov could take another step, Semovich grabbed him by the arm and told him that he had been digging a tunnel under the wall. Semovich said that he had been disposing of the earth by putting it into his boots and then emptying it out later on the road when the prisoners were marching to work. "Keep quiet, old man, and I'll get you out of here too," he whispered, threateningly. "If you tell them what I've been doing, they'll beat the life out of me. But bear in mind, I'll kill you first," he warned. Aksanov, filled with rage, looked at his enemy and angrily said, "I have nothing to gain by escaping. And as for killing me, you killed me long ago." Then, pulling his arm fiercely away from Semovich, Aksanov walked quickly away. The next day, while the convicts were being taken to work, a guard noticed some fresh earth scattered on the road. The prison was searched, and the tunnel was discovered. The warden arrived and began to question each prisoner to find out who had dug the passage. No one admitted that he had dug the tunnel or accused anyone else of digging it. Finally, the warden came to Aksanov. "I know that you are a truthful old man," said the warden. "Tell me who dug the tunnel." Makar Semovich was standing nearby. He tried to appear unconcerned, but his heart was pounding with fear. He did not dare to look at the warden or at Aksanov. Aksanov's lips and hands trembled. A long time passed before he could speak. He was thinking, "Why should I protect the man who has ruined my life? I should make him pay, at last, for all my suffering. But if I tell, they'll probably beat him to death. And what difference would that make? What good would that be to me?" "Well, old man," repeated the warden, "tell us the truth. Who dug the tunnel?" Aksanov glanced at Makar Semovich and replied, "I cannot say. I cannot say, Your Honor. Do whatever you want with me." And despite all of the warden's threats, Aksanov said nothing more. As a result, they failed to discover who had dug the tunnel. That night, as Aksanov was lying on his bunk, someone approached him and sat at his feet. Aksanov peered through the darkness and recognized Semovich. "What more do you want of me?" asked Aksanov. "Why have you come here?" Makar Semovich was silent, so Aksanov sat up and said, "What do you want? Go away, or I will call the guard." Makar Semovich leaned close to Aksanov and whispered, "Ivan Aksanov, forgive me." "Forgive you for what?" Aksanov asked. "It was I who killed the merchant and hid the knife among your things." "I was going to kill you too, but I heard a noise outside. So I hid the knife in your bag and escaped through the window." Aksanov was silent and did not know what to say. Makar Semovich knelt upon the ground. "Ivan Aksanov," he said, "forgive me. Please forgive me. I will confess that I killed the merchant, and you will be released and can go back to your home." "It is easy for you to say that," said Aksanov, but I have suffered for you these 26 years. Where could I go now? My wife is dead, and my children have forgotten me. I have nowhere to go." Makar Semovich bowed his head. "Ivan Aksionov, forgive me," he cried. "The worst beating they could give me would be easier to take than to look at you now. You had pity on me and did not tell them that I dug the tunnel. Forgive me. Please forgive me." And he began to sob. When Aksionov heard him sobbing, he too began to weep. "God will forgive you," said Aksionov. At these words, Aksionov's heart grew light, and he suddenly felt at wonderful peace and freedom in his soul. The next day, Makar Semovich confessed to the crime. But when the order came to release the innocent man, Ivan Aksionov was already dead.